Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is indeed an honor to be able to rise in this place, thanks to the support of the great people of Selkirk and Lake Eastman, many who I've been hearing from about Bill C-2. I will just mention right off the bat that I'll be splitting my time with the member from Edmonton, Griesbaugh. Conservatives always supported toughening up our borders and making sure that we are not just securing the borders, but protecting communities and upholding the rights of Canadians. And in this last election campaign, we fought very hard of laying out a message on how to make sure we secure our borders, and that would include adding more border agents. We need at least a couple of thousand more border agents to properly police the border, not just at ports of entry, which is all this bill does in C2, but we want to make sure that they have the power to police the entire border, whether we're looking at illegal immigration, whether we're looking at people that are trying to run fentanyl into our country and other illicit drugs, whether it is human trafficking, and we often see coming across the border is all the illegal guns. And of course, this bill doesn't address this in its entirety, and that's why I have some concerns. Now, we need to make sure that our borders are secure. And in the campaign, our leader, Pierre Poilievre, talked about installing greater border surveillance, including the use of drones and towers, and having more high-powered scanners at both land crossings and at our seaports to ensure that everything that's coming into this country is looked at, so we know whether or not there is contraband being smuggled into this country, especially the ingredients to make fentanyl and other opioids, which are creating so much tragedy in our communities, on our streets, and really is a sad part that's impacting so many families. And we know that we also need to make sure that we're scanning things leaving this country as well. Nothing in this bill addresses that. So, the theft that we're seeing in automobiles, the illegal exportation of stolen vehicles, that has to stop, and that means that containers need to be scanned, both coming in and going out. Again, nothing is in here. We are concerned that Bill C-2 doesn't address the issue of tracking the departures of those that are in Canada that need to leave. If they fail to meet those dates, then we are going to see them that they're staying in Canada legally and they need to be deported immediately. And this bill does nothing to toughen up penalties for repeat violent offenders. We're talking about stopping human trafficking, gun smuggling, and fentanyl as the main reasons to thicken up our borders and secure them. But the Liberals continue to support soft-on-crime policies, like making sure that repeat violent offenders can actually have access to catch-and-release bail policies. We believe in jail, not bail. And they continue to have their multiple murder discounts in sentencing. This is a big bill. It's over 130-some pages, and that in itself makes it an ominous bill. And we now know that the Liberals have been scrambling since the election to try to finally take some conservative policies, put them in. And so we'll continue to support things that do make Canada safer and more secure. But we do have a lot of concerns about how they've continued to have catch and release bills like Bill C-75 in the last Parliament, Bill C-5. And this is the one that, we want to go after gun smugglers, but the Liberals still erroneously vilify law-abiding firearms owners in this country. And instead of going after the criminals that are smuggling in guns and increasing the penalties for gun smugglers, which they actually reduced in Bill C-5, we want to make sure that we are actually addressing that issue. Now, Mr. Speaker, other issues that we have in here that I am hearing about is a concern, as we just heard in the previous question, is that Canada Post is going to be given the ability to open mail without the proper charter protected rights that would happen with judicial oversight and warrants. That here is clear in the bill. As we were just talking, in section 41 on page 12, the corporation may open mail if it has reasonable grounds to suspect that, and then list those reasons, which would include drug smuggling. But that still should be done under the authority of a warrant, so that Canada Post just can't go out there and start opening it up. We are also concerned, and I'm hearing about this from my constituents on Part 11, that they're going to limit the amount of cash deposits to $10,000. That impacts on those in the agriculture community especially that want to use cash because they either have curbside sales with farmers markets, maybe they're selling livestock and or processed meats, vegetables, other types of horticultural crops out of their yard, and they're collecting cash to do that. And then a strawberry you pick will collect over $10,000 cash easily in a day. And then this is going to say, you can't actually deposit that cash. Cash is still legal tender. And there's ways that we can still enforce the money laundering and terrorist financing rules in this country without going after the legitimate reasons why people collect cash in their day-to-day business activities. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time, there's other parts of this at that's Part 4 and Part 11 on farm gates, Part 14 and 16. There's an erosion on privacy rights and civil liberties of Canadians that I'm hearing about from my constituents. They've been emailing me, messaging me on social media, and we need to actually address that. In my last 4 minutes, I want to talk about Part 5. And Part 5 is to amend the Oceans Act to provide the Coast Guard services would include activities related to security and to authorize the responsible minister to collect, analyze, and disclose information and intelligence. And in that, it provides the power for the minister or any member of the King's Privy Council for Canada to be designated as the Governor-in-Council for the purpose of this section. So this is where we're hearing the transfer of Coast Guard from Fisheries and Oceans over to the administrative powers of the Minister of National Defence. And that's been announced by the Prime Minister. Minister of Defence has talked about it. We've heard from the Chief of Defence Staff and the Vice Chief of Defence Staff on what this is going to look like. We know that the Coast Guard has no interdiction capabilities. It is not a paramilitary organization. It is a civilian organization. They have no guns on board. These ships have no defensive purposes at all. You've got to remember, Coast Guard does search and rescue. They have a lot of science vessels that spend time studying our oceans, and that's important and has to happen. And they will also do transit and transportation assistance by ice breaking in places like the St. Lawrence Seaway. Now, Mr. Speaker, that in itself is all important work that the Coast Guard does. However, it's hard to make the argument that that is in national security or national defense's interest. And this is just another exercise by the Liberals in creative accounting to move government spending from one department into national defense without actually increasing the capabilities of the Canadian Armed Forces. Now, they're not talking about changing the Coast Guard fleet to have them armed up. They're not talking about having the sailors and crew of the Canadian Coast Guard to actually be trained up to use sidearms. We know right now, if the Coast Guard actually comes across somebody that is smuggling in contraband, such as illegal drugs, they have to call the RCMP to come on board to then do the interdiction of those vessels. Same thing, if they saw somebody illegally fishing, they would call the conservation officers with Fisheries and Oceans to come on board to make the interdiction. They would also, if they come across somebody that has entered our waters illegally, either because they're human smuggling or they got lost, then they would call Border Services to come in and process those individuals and make the interdiction. The Coast Guard has absolutely no policing powers or ability to do those interdictions on their own, and it is erroneous to think that the Coast Guard provides any type of security purposes underneath the NATO construct. And I would just caution the government that if they're going to try to count all of the Coast Guard budget under national defense, then they have to actually change the organization so that it can provide those broader services that they're talking about. In the bill, it talks that they're going to support departments, borders, and agencies of the government of Canada through the provision of ship, aircraft, and other services, and security, including security patrols and the collection, analysis, and disclosure of information or intelligence. They don't have that skill set right now. They don't have that ability. The government needs to come clean with Canadians. They need to come clean with NATO and our allies to explain how they can take a civilian organization and decide that this is something that really will improve our national security and our national defense, and will actually increase the lethality and kinetic power of the Canadian Armed Forces, which we know right now, after the lost Liberal decade, that has been broken by the Liberals.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I was interested in the member's comments in regards to the military, law enforcement versus the Coast Guard. And I know he was the Parliamentary Secretary to the Conservative Minister of Defence a number of years back. And is this an issue that was ever raised within the Conservative government? And if so, could he maybe share with the House in terms of whether it's the Conservative position or his own personal position in regards to what direction would he take the Coast Guard?
For Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, what I'm commenting on is that the government plans on moving Coast Guard under the direction of the Minister of National Defence without actually talking about how they're going to make it a security agency, which it is not. It's a civilian organization. So I'm talking about, Mr. Speaker, is that this is something that needs to be clearly identified and described how this would count towards the NATO 2%. When Coast Guard has no capabilities currently to provide that security apparatus, if they're going to now start putting either RCMP and or national defense personnel on board and arm up those ships, then we're talking about something completely different, and we need to understand what that is.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. Le député de Saint-Hyacinthe.
Honourable Member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagot. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question will be simple for my colleague. In his opinion, why and how does he explain that it's taken so much time for the government to take action? Just like my colleague said earlier, they could have done an executive order or made a government decision, and not through this long process of having a bill to take order. Why do we have to wait for President Trump to pull out the big cannons for the government to decide to move forward like this? How come it took so much time? It's not as though there were people already sounding the alarm in this chamber.
Eastman.
Well, I thank my colleague for the question, and welcome to the National Defence Committee with me. We're both serving as vice chairs on the National Defence Committee. I know that there has been much debate about how the Liberals have failed on the border, how they ignored the illegal migration, like we saw at Roxham Road, like we saw at Emerson, Manitoba, and that they welcomed everybody in with open arms rather than actually trying to fix the third-party agreement. It took them 7 years before they finally fixed the third-party agreement with the United States so that that type of illegal migration would stop. We're back into a similar situation. They waited until Donald Trump started yelling at Canada, especially under Justin Trudeau, to do something about the border, to act. They've had a decade here. I've completely ignored it. Either they ran out of ideas or they're just completely incompetent.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The member for Calgary-Crowfoot.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for bringing to the House's attention the issue around just merely transferring the ministry under which the Coast Guard operates from one department to defence without actually increasing or enhancing the defence capabilities of Canada. Taking a civilian force that undertakes civilian activity and bring it under the authority of the Minister of National Defence doesn't make it a defence organization. Now, we appreciate and we know the vital importance of the Coast Guard, but in order to make it a military force that increases Canada's defence capability, it needs to change. So I'd like him to comment further on that.
Honourable member.
I want to thank my friend from Calgary-Crowfoot for his comment, because, the Canadian Coast Guard does an important role. And if they were going to move over national defense and start transitioning it into be a paramilitary organization to actually be able to do interdictions and border security, I'd be very supportive of that. But right now, I just actually want to know if this is anything that means anything in national defense, or is this just more creative accounting by the Liberals, taking expenditures at other departments, ramming it under national defense like they have for the last 7 years, and try to say that's how we're going to reach 2%? That doesn't increase the capabilities and operational readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces in any way, shape, and form. We actually need to see investment in the kinetic equipment that's so desperately needed, like new planes, new tanks, new labs, and new ships, and they're dragging their feet in every time they step up, and they fail to make a difference.